My name is Bridget Taylor, and I was 32 the night my family finalized their theft of my life. I was sitting 50 feet away from them, watching the whole thing happen. The service doors of the Wilmington Crystal Room swung open every 40 seconds, letting out a rush of hot air, the smell of seared scallops, and the sharp clatter of porcelain. I sat in that draft at a small, bare overflow table that bumped against the busboy station. Out on the main floor, beneath cascading tiers of Austrian glass, my relatives mingled in a haze of expensive perfume and tailored silk. I remained in the shadows. I wore a simple charcoal blazer with my dark hair pulled back into a tight knot. My gaze rested steadily on the center of the room, fixing on the primary VIP table. My brother-in-law Derek stood at the head of that table. He tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute, demanding the attention of the surrounding investors. The overhead light caught the sheen of sweat pooling at his hairline. His custom Italian suit looked half a size too tight across his shoulders, straining as he raised his glass to toast his imminent success. Beside him, my sister Victoria beamed. Her fingers rested lightly on the collar of her silk gown, touching the deep blue glint of a sapphire pendant. It was our late grandmother's necklace, the one explicitly left to me. Next to Victoria sat our mother, Patricia, nodding with practiced grace, her posture rigid and triumphant. I looked down at the stark glow of my phone resting flat on the tablecloth. The screen displayed an open digital document. It was a property deed for 50 acres of coastal land in Sussex County. At the bottom of the page on the guarantor line sat my own signature. I traced the digital ink with my thumb. The letter T lacked the sharp downward slash I always used. It was an amateur forgery. The document certified that my land had been pledged as hard collateral to secure a massive loan for Derek's sinking logistics company. Across the room, Derek met my eyes. A thin smirk spread across his face as he tilted his glass in my direction. He believed he had boxed the family outcast into a corner. Welcome back to the Linda Vengeance channel, where ordinary women face impossible families and answer with quiet strength instead of noise. If you have ever been the one expected to sacrifice everything for people who give you nothing, you are in the right place. Pull up a chair, drop a comment telling me your age, and be sure to subscribe, because this story starts with a federal crime and ends somewhere my family never saw coming. To understand how I ended up sitting in the dark holding proof of my brother-in-law's impending indictment, you have to go back exactly 1 hour. The fuse was lit outside in the damp autumn air, accompanied by the low, rough idle of a 1998 Ford pickup. I pulled up to the sweeping marble steps of the Gala. The valet in a crisp red vest hesitated, staring at the rusted wheel wells of my father's old truck. The contrast between my battered Ford and the line of leased European sports cars was jarring. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cold wind cutting through my blazer. Patricia, Victoria, and my older brother Harrison were already waiting on the steps. They formed a solid wall of velvet and disdain. Patricia crossed her arms, her eyes sweeping over my practical shoes. She asked loudly enough for the arriving guests to hear if I had parked out back with the rest of the sanitation workers. Harrison laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed off the stone pillars. I did not answer. I walked up the steps, keeping my breathing even. As I passed them, my cousin Maya stepped out from behind a marble column. Maya is a sharp, observant African-American woman who married into my father's side of the family, and she always despised their toxic dynamics. Maya gripped my forearm, her dark eyes darting toward the valet's stand. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She told me Derek had been calling the county clerk all week, asking frantic questions about the tax assessments on my Sussex property. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I looked past Maya to where Derek was handing his keys to a valet. He was laughing, but his hands were shaking. The verbal abuse from my mother and siblings was just a smokescreen. The real threat was already in motion. I took a coat check ticket from Patricia without a word, stepping through the heavy brass doors into the lion's den. 60 minutes before the toast, I navigated the '98 Ford up the sweeping circular driveway of the Crystal Room. The engine rumbled with a steady, heavy idle that vibrated through the floorboards. My father bought this vehicle brand new when he started his first shipping route. He believed in steel and grease and paying in cash. He despised debt. Wilmington nights in late autumn hold a specific damp chill, and the valet line stretched down the block, packed with pristine imported sedans. I pulled up to the red carpet. A young attendant in a crisp maroon vest stepped forward, his hand freezing mid-reach as he took in the rusted wheel wells and the faded green paint of my front bumper. He looked around, expecting a delivery driver to jump out with a catering tray. I shifted the gear stick into park and handed him the single brass key. I told him to keep it close to the front. He nodded, swallowing his confusion, as I stepped out into the biting wind. I did not even make it to the first marble step before the welcoming committee formed. Patricia stood at the top landing, flanked by Victoria and Harrison. They looked like a curated advertisement for a life they could not actually afford. My mother wore an emerald silk gown that likely cost a month of my father's old wages. She held her clutch with both hands, her knuckles white, tight enough to snap the metal clasp. Patricia scanned my practical charcoal blazer and sensible low heels. Her mouth tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She asked if I found the blazer in a lost and found bin at the local community center. She kept her voice pitched in that specific aristocratic register, loud enough to carry to the nearby guests, but smooth enough to pass as friendly banter to a stranger. I looked at the slight tremor in her hands. She projected superiority, but her nervous energy gave her away. They were terrified. Victoria stepped forward, adjusting her fur wrap. She smelled of heavy floral perfume and deep anxiety. She hissed that Derek had potential investors inside, and my presence was an active embarrassment to their brand. She told me to toss the valet an extra $20 to park the eyesore in a back alley out of sight. I stared at her, taking in the defensive tilt of her chin. Victoria always needed the world to validate her choices because she lacked the spine to validate them herself. She married Derek for the illusion of stability, and now she was drowning in his leveraged lies. Harrison leaned against the stone balustrade, swirling a clear drink over ice. His custom tuxedo fit perfectly, but his eyes carried the hollow, desperate look of a man living paycheck to paycheck. He laughed a sharp, grating sound. He told our mother to relax because every high society event needed someone to fetch the coats, and I was already dressed for the job. Harrison built his entire personality on tearing down anyone who reminded him of actual labor. He hated the truck because it represented the honest sweat he refused to exert. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a defense. Arguing with them was a waste of oxygen. When you argue, you signal that you care about their opinion. I offered them absolute, suffocating silence. I watched them shift uncomfortably under my steady gaze. Patricia cleared her throat, the silence unnerving her more than any insult could have. They expected me to shrink or to cry. My stillness felt like a weapon they did not know how to disarm. Before Patricia could launch another barb, a figure detached herself from the shadows of the marble portico. Cousin Maya moved with an effortless grace that my mother always envied. Maya is a brilliant corporate auditor, an African-American woman who married my uncle 10 years ago and spent every subsequent family gathering quietly observing the Taylor family delusions. Maya wore a simple black column dress, her dark eyes sharp and focused. She did not bother greeting my mother. She stepped right past the wall of fake smiles and caught my wrist. Her grip was firm and urgent. Maya pulled me a few steps away from the toxic trio, using a cluster of arriving donors as a physical shield. The scent of her subtle sandalwood perfume cut through Victoria's cloying floral scent. Maya leaned in close, her voice dropping to a rapid, serious whisper. She told me to listen carefully. She had spent the afternoon at the county records building, running background checks for her firm. While she was there, she saw Derek standing at the public access terminal. Maya said Derek was sweating through his shirt standing at the clerk window. He was demanding printed copies of the tax assessments and zoning permits for my 50 acres in Sussex County. He paid a premium for expedited physical copies of the property lines. Maya asked me point blank why a man obsessed with luxury high-rises would care about a dormant coastal property he always called a useless dirt patch. The cold wind suddenly felt sharp against my neck. Sussex County was not just dirt. It was a grandfathered deep-water port zone. My father left it to me because he knew its structural value for industrial logistics. The rest of the family took the liquid cash and laughed at my inheritance. If Derek was pulling official county tax records, he was not just curious. You only pull assessment records when you need to prove the value of an asset to a third party. You pull them when you are preparing to leverage the land. I asked Maya if he filed any new paperwork. She shook her head, stating the clerk refused to tell her without a subpoena. But Maya squeezed my wrist, her gaze intense. She warned me that Derek was desperate. He had been bouncing checks at the country club. A desperate man will burn down someone else's house to keep himself warm. The dynamic shifted on its axis. My mother and siblings mocking my clothes was a childish distraction. The real threat was quiet, and it involved my name. My pulse steadied into a slow, calculated rhythm. The game had changed from high school bullying to corporate espionage. Patricia realized Maya and I were having a private conversation. She marched over, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She inserted herself between us, forcing a tight, artificial smile. Patricia told Maya the gala was starting and there was no time for idle gossip with the black sheep. Then my mother turned to me. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out 3 crumpled silk coats. She shoved the heavy garments into my arms along with a numbered paper ticket. She instructed me to find the coat check room and make myself useful before dragging my muddy boots onto the crystal floor. It was a calculated gesture designed to remind me of my place in her hierarchy. To her, I was not a daughter. I was the help. I looked down at the pile of silk in my arms. I looked up at the brass doors leading into the venue. I took the coats. I did not throw them back at her. I accepted the burden with a calm nod. Let them believe I was broken. Let them believe I was nothing more than the obedient punchline to their cruel jokes. A predator is easiest to trap when they think their prey is already dead. I turned my back on the cold November night and pushed open the heavy brass doors. The heat of the ballroom rushed over me, bringing the smell of roasting meat and the dull roar of 100 conversations. I walked straight into the lion's den, holding my mother's coats, fully aware that a financial guillotine had already been raised above my head. I just needed to find out who was holding the rope. I handed the 3 crumpled silk coats to the attendant behind the mahogany counter, taking my numbered paper tag without a word. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer and walked into the main expanse of the crystal room. The floor plan of a high society charity gala always follows a strict, unforgiving hierarchy. Wealth and influence radiate outward from the center stage like ripples in a pond. The billionaires and politicians occupy the glowing nucleus beneath the brightest chandeliers. The desperate climbers orbit the edges, hovering near the floral arrangements. I walked the perimeter, scanning the gilded place cards at the primary tables. My name was missing from the Taylor family section. I kept walking, letting the crowd part around me. I found my seating assignment taped to a small, bare overflow table. It was pushed practically inside the swinging kitchen doors. Every few seconds, a harried waiter rushed past, bringing a gust of hot air flavored with seared meat and industrial dish soap. My mother and siblings wanted to erase me from their curated public image. They needed me invisible tonight, so Derek could spin his web of corporate success without my blue-collar aesthetic ruining the illusion. I pulled out the rigid wooden chair and sat down. The darkness of the service corridor folded around me, cloaking my presence. I did not feel humiliated by the banishment. I felt a quiet, strategic satisfaction. They thought they were punishing me with isolation. Instead, they handed me the perfect tactical vantage point. From this unlit corner, I could observe the entire ballroom unseen. Being invisible has distinct advantages. Predators forget you have eyes when you stay out of the light. The sharp chill from the kitchen draft hit the back of my neck. The dropping temperature felt exactly like the air conditioning in the downtown legal suite 3 years ago. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the bitter memory surface. My father had just died. We sat around a sprawling mahogany table for the reading of his will. He built a regional fortune hauling freight, block by block, building a life on calloused hands and diesel smoke. He always said sweat was the only currency that mattered. He wanted his legacy split evenly among his children to ensure we all had a sturdy foundation. But Patricia and Harrison hired a team of ruthless estate litigators. They found obscure technical loopholes in my father's outdated trust structures. They legally cannibalized the liquid assets, draining the bank accounts and investment portfolios before the ink on his death certificate even dried. I remember sitting in that freezing office, watching my brother lean across the polished table. His expensive silk tie rested on the yellow legal pads. He laughed a sharp, mocking sound as the lawyers read the revised inventory. They left me exactly two things: the rusted Ford pickup truck and a 50-acre parcel of coastal marshland in Sussex County. Harrison called it worthless dirt. He told me I could build a mud hut and live among the seagulls while they moved into penthouse suites. They thought they ruined me that afternoon. They believed they stripped away my future, leaving me destitute. They did not understand the structural value of deep water port zoning. They did not know that while they spent the stolen cash on luxury leases and country club dues, I turned that dirt into the foundation of a quiet logistics empire. I opened my eyes, bringing the glowing ballroom back into focus. The string quartet played a frantic classical arrangement over the hum of $100 conversations. I watched my family at their central table. They operated like actors on a brightly lit stage, projecting an illusion of infinite wealth. Then Harrison broke away from the group. He spotted me in the shadows and sauntered over, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. He stopped a few feet from my table, raising his hand to snap his fingers at a passing busboy. The sharp crack echoed over my head, cutting through the ambient noise. The young worker flinched, spilling ice water onto his silver serving tray. Harrison did not even look at the boy. He looked down at me, his lips curling into a familiar sneer. He ordered me to get up and fetch him a fresh double bourbon from the bar. He stated I belonged with the catering staff anyway, so I might as well make myself useful instead of taking up valuable square footage. I did not stand. I did not shift my weight or break my posture. I placed both hands flat on the white tablecloth. I looked up into his flushed, arrogant face. I let a long beat of silence stretch between us, letting the surrounding noise fade into the background. I told him, no. Just one single razor-sharp syllable. No. It hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. Harrison blinked, his sneer faltering. He opened his mouth to issue a loud public threat, but the dead calm in my eyes stopped the words in his throat. Bullies operate on a predictable script. They expect frightened resistance or tearful submission. They do not know how to process total, unwavering indifference. My refusal was a brick wall he did not anticipate hitting. He took a slow step backward, the false bravado draining from his shoulders. He turned on his heel and walked away, navigating back toward the safety of the main bar. I tracked his movement through the glittering crowd. He reached the long mahogany bar joining Patricia and Victoria. I watched them order a round of top-shelf drinks leaning against the polished wood. When the bartender presented the leather payment folio, Patricia slid a gold credit card across the counter with a practiced flick of her wrist. I watched the bartender swipe it once. He frowned, tapping the digital screen. He swiped it a second time. He leaned over the counter, speaking in a low, discreet tone, shaking his head. Patricia went rigid. Her aristocratic posture vanished instantly. She snatched the gold card back, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. She shoved her elbow into Harrison's side, prompting him to pull out his own wallet. He produced a different card, handing it over with trembling fingers. The transaction went through, but his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped under his skin. Beside them, Victoria touched her throat, her fingers nervously tracing the stolen sapphire pendant resting on her collarbone. A cold calculation locked into place in my mind. Maya was right. The hushed warning on the front steps took on a terrifying new clarity. My family was out of money. The designer gowns, the tailored tuxedos, the leased luxury cars idling in the valet lot, it was all a fragile, hollow shell. They were maxing out their final credit lines just to buy overpriced cocktails and keep up appearances. Their aristocratic facade was rotting from the inside out. They were parading around the room like royalty, but they were functionally bankrupt. The entire Taylor family survival hung by a single, fraying thread. That thread was Derek and the logistics supply contract he was trying to pitch tonight. If Derek failed to secure the billionaire investor money, they all went down. Their entire lifestyle would collapse into foreclosure and public ruin. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a crystal-clear picture. Desperate people do not ask politely for help. They take it by force. Derek pulling my property tax records was not idle curiosity. They needed capital immediately, and I owned 50 acres of unencumbered coastal land. They had stolen my liquid inheritance 3 years ago, and now they were coming for the real estate. I watched Victoria leave the bar clutching her cocktail. Her eyes locked onto my dark corner. She started weaving through the crowd, heading straight for my table with purposeful strides. The opening skirmishes were over. The petty insults were finished. The real extortion was about to begin. I stood up from the unlit overflow table just as Victoria charted a direct path toward my corner. I decided to meet her halfway, refusing to let her trap me against the swinging kitchen doors. I navigated through the outer edges of the cocktail reception area, where the ambient noise of the gala provided a natural sound barrier. A towering swan carved from a single block of clear ice dominated the secondary dessert spread. Condensation dripped from its frozen wings, pooling quietly onto a polished silver tray. The air immediately surrounding the display carried a distinct, biting chill. Victoria intercepted my path there, using the frozen sculpture to block the view of the wealthy donors milling about the main floor. She did not bother with pleasantries. The bright, artificial smile she wore for the society photographers evaporated the second we stepped out of their sightline. Her face settled into a tense, hardened mask. She gripped her crystal cocktail glass with a white-knuckled intensity, her manicured nails digging into the fragile ridges of the cup. She demanded I sign a legal document. She did not formulate it as a request or a sibling favor. It was a strict directive issued from a perceived superior to a subordinate. She explained in rushed, hushed tones that Derek needed a primary guarantor for a short-term bridge loan. She called it a temporary high-interest lifeline necessary to keep his logistics firm afloat just until his new lucrative investor contract cleared the final underwriting stages. She attempted to frame the extortion as a sacred family obligation. She leaned in close, invading my personal space. Her heavy, floral perfume turned sour, mixing with the sharp tang of gin on her breath. She lowered her voice to a harsh hiss. She claimed the family had carried my dead weight for years. She wove a fabricated narrative insisting Patricia and Harrison shielded me from financial ruin after our father died. She had the audacity to say they kept a roof over my head during my darkest hours, and now it was my fundamental duty to repay that boundless generosity. I stood perfectly still, letting her spin her web of rewritten history. She expected me to forget how they locked me out of the estate accounts within hours of the funeral. She wanted me to ignore the brutal reality of their coordinated theft. They drained the liquid assets, dividing the cash among themselves while I was busy arranging the burial services. They stole my safety net, and now she dared to stand in front of me, demanding my signature to save her own sinking ship. I lowered my gaze, ignoring her frantic eyes. I focused my attention on the hollow of her throat. The deep blue sapphire caught the refracted light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, casting a faint azure glow against her collarbone. Our grandmother wore that exact necklace every single Sunday. In her final days, when her hands were frail and shaking, she pressed the worn velvet box into my palms. She wrote a handwritten legal codicil specifically naming me as the sole inheritor of the gem because she knew the true greedy nature of her other relatives. Patricia and Victoria raided the house while I was at the mortuary. They took the velvet box before the estate lawyers even filed the basic probate paperwork. I raised my hand and pointed a single finger at the stone. I kept my vocal tone low and steady, stripped of all emotion. I informed her she was wearing stolen property. I reminded her the sapphire belonged to me and she had zero right to drape it around her neck. Victoria rolled her eyes, scoffing at the blunt accusation. She waved her free hand, brushing off the blatant theft like a speck of dust on her silk sleeve. She called the necklace a trivial detail. She claimed I was being absurdly petty over an outdated piece of jewelry, while her entire future hung in the balance. She insisted the sapphire looked better paired with her designer gown anyway, attempting to justify the robbery with superficial vanity. The sheer audacity hung in the cold air between us. She stood there wearing my stolen inheritance while simultaneously begging for my financial backing. I looked her dead in the eyes, piercing her fragile aristocratic armor. I delivered my answer with the same flat, unyielding cadence I used on Harrison earlier. I told her no. I stated clearly I would never co-sign a single piece of paper for Derek. I refused to tie my name, my credit, or my future to his failing business or her fabricated lifestyle. Victoria lost her composure. The polished socialite facade cracked wide open, revealing the terrified woman hiding underneath. Her voice spiked, taking on a shrill, desperate edge that drew brief glances from a nearby group of investors. She took a step closer, pressing into my space. She dropped the gaslighting and moved straight to bare threats. She reminded me that Derek played golf with the county commissioners every weekend. She boasted about their deep political leverage within the local zoning office. She said if I refused to help the family survive this temporary cash flow issue, she would personally ensure the zoning board reclassified my 50 acres in Sussex County. She promised to bury the coastal parcel in endless environmental red tape, making it legally impossible to build on or sell. She vowed to turn my only remaining asset into a permanent tax burden, draining my meager resources until I begged for bankruptcy. It was a desperate, unhinged threat born from total panic. She thought the Sussex land was just a barren marsh where I lived a pathetic blue-collar existence. She had zero idea that parcel already served as the central dispatch hub for my corporate logistics network. She did not know my legal team spent 2 years fortifying those zoning rights behind ironclad blind trusts and shell corporations. Her threat was an empty gun, but the venomous intent to destroy me was deeply genuine. They were willing to burn my life to the ground just to keep themselves warm for one more season. Victoria glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion. She waited for me to beg for mercy or offer a desperate compromise. I simply offered her a blank, unreadable stare. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I told her she was welcome to try. Victoria let out a sharp, frustrated breath. She realized the intimidation tactic failed. She spun around her silk gown, swishing harshly against the marble floor. She stormed off toward the VIP section, leaving me alone by the melting swan. I watched her retreat, noting the rigid stiffness in her spine. She was heading back to tell Derek the coercion plan failed. I stood alone in the cold draft of the ice display, calculating the timeline. If the legal bridge loan was off the table, Derek would have to resort to his backup plan. My blazer pocket vibrated, a silent, heavy buzz against my hip. I reached inside and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim corner, casting a harsh light over my hands. It was a secure, encrypted text message from my corporate chief financial officer. I swiped the screen, unlocking the device. The notification preview displayed a high-priority alert regarding Derek and his core holding company. I tapped the screen, opening the attached financial dossier. I scrolled through the first page of the summary, reading the stark black text. The truth was far worse than a simple bridge loan request. Derek was not just bouncing country club checks. The documents revealed the true scale of his financial ruin and the exact desperate measure he took to fix it. The silent auction was about to begin, but the real bidding war had already been fought and lost. I pocketed my phone and stepped away from the melting swan. A gentle chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the opening of the silent auction. Long tables draped in black velvet lined the far wall, displaying donated luxury items under focused halogen spotlights. Guests drifted toward the displays, holding crystal glasses and hovering over the bid sheets. I navigated the perimeter, keeping my distance from the main crowd. I had no intention of purchasing a weekend getaway to Aspen or a private wine tasting. I walked past the diamond tennis bracelets and signed sports memorabilia. Near the end of the final table, a solitary item caught my attention. It was not flashy. It was a framed, vintage maritime map of the Delaware coastline, dated 1912. The cartography featured faded ink on heavy textured parchment. I stepped closer, studying the intricate coastal details. The artist had carefully outlined the natural depth gradients of the local waterways using faint blue crosshatching. My eyes tracked down the coastline, tracing the southern peninsula until I found it, Sussex County. There, nestled in the lower quadrant, was my exact 50-acre parcel. The map explicitly marked the deep water channels that bordered my property. Those very channels were the reason my land held grandfathered industrial port zoning. It was the geographic choke point of the entire regional supply chain. I reached out and picked up the silver pen resting next to the item. The current bid sat at a modest $200. I wrote my name and increased the figure to $300. It was a quiet gesture, a small tribute to my father, who spent his life navigating those exact waters. I placed the pen down and turned to leave. A sharp intake of breath sounded directly behind my right shoulder. Patricia materialized from the crowd, her emerald silk gown rustling against the velvet table skirt. Harrison flanked her, clutching a fresh highball glass. They must have been watching me from the bar, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Patricia looked down at the bid sheet, her eyes narrowing. She read my name and let out a short, practiced scoff. She picked up the pen, holding it delicately between her thumb and index finger. She wrote her own name, crossing out my bid and doubling the amount to $600. Harrison leaned over her shoulder, inspecting the framed map. He snorted, a derisive sound that drew the attention of a nearby couple. He asked our mother why she would waste money on a moldy piece of paper detailing a bunch of swamps. Patricia smiled, a thin, predatory curving of her lips. She stated she did not care about the item itself. She simply wanted to ensure I walked away with nothing. She proclaimed that allowing me to win even a cheap antique would set a terrible precedent for the evening. I remained perfectly still. I did not betray a single fraction of disappointment. I picked up the pen and wrote $900. I wanted to test the limits of their spite. Harrison snatched the silver instrument from my fingers. His face flushed a deep, mottled pink, fueled by the liquor and the thrill of the petty conflict. He scrawled his signature, bringing the total to $2,000. He tossed the pen onto the table with a loud clatter. He crossed his arms, grinning at me with unearned triumph. He told me to go back to my dark corner before I embarrassed myself, trying to play a game I could never afford. Patricia patted his arm, murmuring her approval. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a barricade of arrogance. They were spending money they did not possess just to assert dominance over a daughter they despised. They failed to grasp the profound irony staring them in the face. They were engaging in a ruthless bidding war over a drawing of the exact real estate they were trying to steal. They viewed the map as a cheap trinket to use as a weapon. They had no idea it was a detailed schematic of my $500 million logistics hub. I sensed a shift in the air a few feet away. An elderly gentleman stood near the adjacent display case, quietly observing the entire exchange. He wore a modest, unbranded charcoal suit that lacked the ostentatious tailoring of the other guests. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture remained upright. He did not say a word, but his eyes locked onto mine. He offered a slow, deliberate nod, conveying a deep well of silent sympathy. He recognized the cruelty for what it was. He saw the hollow nature of my family and the quiet dignity of my restraint. I returned his nod, acknowledging the shared understanding. I looked back at Patricia and Harrison. Their smug expressions were painted onto their faces. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the table. I gestured toward the clipboard with an open palm, conceding the battle. I told them, congratulations. I stated they had just purchased a very expensive reminder of what they would never own. Patricia frowned, confused by the phrasing, but too proud to ask for clarification. She turned her attention back to the map, preening over her hollow victory. I walked away, leaving them to calculate how they would pay a $2,000 charity invoice with declined credit cards. I returned to my isolated table near the kitchen doors. The draft felt refreshing against my skin. I sat down and slipped my hand into my blazer pocket. My phone vibrated with a steady, persistent rhythm. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. The encrypted message from my chief financial officer remained open. I bypassed the executive summary and scrolled directly to the core financial tables detailing Derek and his logistics firm. The columns of numbers told a brutal, undeniable story. The bridge loan Victoria demanded earlier was a microscopic drop in an empty bucket. Derek was not experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. He was drowning in toxic debt. His operational accounts held zero liquidity. He had missed 3 consecutive payroll cycles. His primary fleet of transport vehicles faced imminent repossession due to defaulted commercial leases. The entire company was a hollow shell, propped up by forged invoices and fraudulent revenue projections. He was bankrupt. I swiped to the final page of the dossier where my financial officer highlighted the external debt ownership. When a corporation begins defaulting on vendor payments, those accounts receivable are often sold off to secondary collection agencies at a steep discount. My blind trust operated a specialized debt acquisition division. We frequently purchased distressed assets to consolidate our leverage over regional competitors. I read the designated paragraphs twice, letting the reality wash over me. My corporate acquisitions team had spent the last 6 months quietly buying up every single defaulted note tied to Derek. We purchased his overdue equipment leases. We bought the defaulted vendor contracts. We acquired the high-risk commercial paper he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. He owed millions, and he owed all of it to a single holding company. My pulse beat a steady, slow rhythm against my collarbone. The truth clicked into place with the cold finality of a steel vault locking. Derek believed he was attending this gala to pitch a lucrative contract to a billionaire investor and secure a bailout. He thought he could steal my land to fake his solvency. He had no idea the billionaire investor was a ghost entity controlled entirely by me. I did not just hold a forged deed. I held his entire existence in the palm of my hand. My blind trust was his sole remaining creditor. He did not owe the banks. He did not owe the private equity firms. He owed Bridget Taylor. The man raising his glass in the center of the room thought he was the apex predator. He failed to realize he was already dead, and I was the one holding the shovel. I locked my phone screen, placing it face down on the table. The next phase of the trap was ready to snap shut. I left the overflow table, craving a moment of absolute silence. The main ballroom felt like a pressurized cabin filled with toxic fumes and the sharp clatter of silver against china. I navigated away from the kitchen doors toward the quiet corridor housing the guest restrooms. The thick, patterned carpeting gave way to polished marble tile, echoing with the solitary click of my low heels. The acoustic shift dampened the frantic string quartet, turning the gala noise into a dull, distant ocean roar. The air here smelled of expensive floral arrangements and harsh industrial citrus cleaner. He stepped out from a recessed alcove blocking my path. Derek moved with the frantic, predatory energy of a man running out of time. His physical presence was deliberately calibrated to intimidate. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, but his posture carried the rigid stiffness of a cornered animal. A thin film of perspiration coated his upper lip, catching the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hallway. He exhaled a breath heavy with the scent of fermented juniper and mint, a desperate gin cocktail meant to steady his fraying nerves. His custom-tailored suit jacket pulled tight across his chest, the fabric straining against his erratic breathing. He chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound, lacking any genuine humor. He told me my little standoff with Victoria by the ice swan was cute, but ultimately pointless. He explained that my sister possessed a fragile constitution for high-stakes corporate maneuvers. He framed her failure to secure my signature as a minor marital inconvenience, rather than a failed extortion plot. He took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly against the polished stone. He wanted me to feel trapped in the narrow corridor. Derek reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out his smartphone, tapping the high-resolution screen with a manicured thumb. He turned the device around, forcing it into my direct line of sight. It was a scanned PDF document. The stark white background glared against the dim hallway, illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. I recognized the dense legal formatting immediately. It was a commercial property lien and collateralization agreement. I scanned the digital paragraphs. He had pledged my 50 acres of coastal Sussex County real estate as the primary guarantor asset for a massive commercial credit line. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the screen. A digital rendering of my signature sat perfectly aligned on the dotted line. He lowered the phone and glanced down at his left wrist. He wore a heavy platinum chronograph, an imported luxury timepiece that retailed for more than the average annual household salary. A faint smudge marred the crystal face. He lifted his thumb, casually buffing away the imperfection while he spoke. He did not look at me. He looked at his own reflection in the polished metal. He explained that waiting for my permission was an administrative bottleneck his enterprise could not afford. He stated he took the liberty of expediting the paperwork to ensure his investors saw a fully collateralized portfolio before tonight's keynote address. He called the forgery an executive override. He treated the falsification of a financial instrument like a minor accounting error. I stared at his casually moving thumb. The sheer hubris was staggering. He was completely detached from the legal reality of his actions. I read the specific federal statutes hovering in my mind like a projected textbook. Falsification of a commercial instrument, identity theft, federal wire fraud. He had transmitted fraudulent documents across state banking lines to secure capital. My corporate trust employed former federal prosecutors who would categorize this as a textbook felony carrying a mandatory minimum prison sentence. Derek finished polishing the timepiece and dropped his arm. He leaned forward, invading my personal space, assuming my silence was born of shock. He theorized that I was currently experiencing a surge of misplaced righteous indignation. He highly recommended I swallow it and walk away. He laid out his twisted logic, calculating my net worth based on my sensible charcoal blazer and the rusted Ford parked outside with the valets. He assumed I possessed zero liquid capital. He stated that hiring a competent litigator required a $50,000 retainer just to file the initial discovery motions. He sneered, pointing out I could barely afford a dry cleaning bill, let alone a protracted legal battle against his supposed corporate war chest. He truly believed his fabricated wealth functioned as an impenetrable shield against my blue-collar poverty. He thought the Sussex land was just a cheap dirt patch. He had no idea he had just fraudulently collateralized the central dispatch hub of a $500 million shipping network. Derek married Victoria because she offered the aristocratic pedigree he desperately lacked. My father saw through his salesman pitch instantly, calling him a hollow suit on the day they met. That rejection festered inside Derek for years. Stealing my land was not just a financial necessity to save his failing logistics company. It was an act of profound, ego-driven vengeance. He wanted to strip the favored blue-collar daughter of her final remaining asset to prove the old man wrong. I needed the digital file. A physical glance at a glowing screen meant nothing in a courtroom. I required the metadata, the exact timestamp, and the originating email address to prove the electronic transmission of fraudulent materials. I had spent 3 years learning how to mask my intent behind a blank expression while negotiating international freight contracts. Dealing with an arrogant brother-in-law was child's play by comparison. I forced my shoulders to drop an inch. I slowed my breathing. exhaling a shaky breath, simulating the physical signs of absolute defeat. I let my jaw slacken slightly, allowing a micro-expression of panic to cross my features before burying it under a mask of weary resignation. I lowered my gaze, focusing on the tip of his polished leather Oxfords. I asked him how I was supposed to explain the sudden property encumbrance to the local tax assessor. I kept my voice small, fragile, lacking any trace of the iron resolve I used on Harrison earlier. I requested a copy of the falsified document. I told him I needed it for my personal records, just to know what I was dealing with when the county foreclosure notices inevitably arrived at my doorstep. Derek bought the performance entirely, his chest puffed out, expanding against the strained seams of his suit. He thrived on breaking people. The sight of my simulated surrender fed his starving ego. He tapped his screen a few times, navigating to his outbox. He executed the transfer, sending the file to my outdated personal email address. He pocketed the device and offered a final parting insult. He told me to go back to my little table by the kitchen and enjoy watching him secure his legacy from the cheap seats. He turned and strode back toward the glowing archway of the ballroom, ready to deliver his triumphant toast. I stood alone in the cold marble corridor. The sound of his footsteps faded into the ambient noise of the gala. My blazer pocket vibrated against my hip, a single heavy pulse. I withdrew the device and opened the encrypted inbox. The PDF sat there, a pristine digital confession tied directly to his primary IP address. I did not feel anger. I felt the clean, sterile satisfaction of a surgeon identifying a tumor. I tapped the forwarding icon, routing the attachment directly to the senior litigation partner at my corporate legal division. I tapped the screen, bringing up the digital keyboard. I did not draft a lengthy explanation. My lawyers already knew his financial profile intimately. I typed a single, solitary word in the subject line: execute. I pressed send. The digital arrow vanished, carrying his destruction through the cellular network. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned toward the ballroom doors. It was time to watch the dead man give his toast. I stepped out of the marble corridor, leaving the sterile quiet behind. Pushing through the brass doors, I re-entered the suffocating atmosphere of the crystal room. The string quartet had transitioned into a frantic, upbeat tempo, attempting to inject artificial joy into a room heavy with financial anxiety. The applause from Derek, concluding his boastful toast, still rippled through the central tables. I navigated the perimeter, charting a course back to my isolated corner. My mother stood near a towering arrangement of white orchids. She held a fresh, crystal flute of pale champagne, gesturing broadly with her free hand. Patricia was performing. She had cornered a local municipal alderman, deploying her practiced, aristocratic charm to secure political favors. She fed on the attention vibrating with a nervous, frantic energy. She took a step backward, requiring more physical space to emphasize her fabricated anecdote. She did not bother to check her blind spot. She assumed the lesser guests would simply part ways to accommodate her trajectory. She collided hard with a figure passing directly behind her. The unexpected impact disrupted her delicate balance. The delicate crystal stemware slipped from her manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the polished stone floor, shattering upon impact with a sharp, resonant crack. A wave of effervescent liquid splashed upward, soaking the dark fabric of the pedestrian. The victim was the elderly gentleman from the silent auction table, the man who had offered me a sympathetic nod during the petty bidding war over the coastal map. He stood perfectly still, looking down at the spreading wet stain darkening his right lapel. He did not cry out or demand an apology. He simply assessed the damage with a calm, analytical detachment. Patricia possessed a fragile ego that shattered faster than crystal stemware. When she felt embarrassed, her psychological defense mechanism mandated immediate, cruel deflection. She refused to accept fault for her own carelessness. She went on the offensive. She pivoted sharply, her emerald gown swishing against the wet floor tiles. She raised her voice, projecting her outrage across the surrounding tables. She accused the older gentleman of lurking in the shadows and deliberately obstructing her path. She branded him clumsy staff, assuming his unbranded modest suit meant he belonged to the venue payroll. She demanded to know his immediate supervisor, insisting he be removed from the catering rotation before he ruined another expensive garment. I closed the distance between us in 3 long, rapid strides. I reached a nearby busboy station and snatched a crisp white linen napkin from the stack. I stepped squarely between Patricia and the older gentleman, physically inserting my body as a barricade against her verbal assault. I turned my back on my mother, treating her hysterical demands like irrelevant background noise. I extended the folded cloth toward the gentleman. I kept my vocal tone low and steady, projecting a profound calm to counteract the surrounding chaos. I apologized for the disruption. I told him accidents happen frequently in overcrowded spaces, refusing to validate the fabricated narrative my mother was screaming to the nearby donors. The gentleman accepted the linen. As he took the fabric, his fingers brushed against mine. He paused. The motion arrested his attention. He looked down, examining my hands resting in the bright ambient light of the chandelier. My hands lacked the pristine, glossy manicure common among the socialites circling the room. They carried a distinct, rough texture. The knuckles bore faint, faded scars, and the palms featured thick, permanent calluses. They were the physical receipt of a decade spent gripping heavy diesel steering wheels, pulling industrial cargo ratchets, and inspecting greasy freight lines. I built my corporate empire from the asphalt up, long before I transitioned into the sterile environment of a boardroom. The older man lifted his gaze, meeting my eyes. He smiled. It was a genuine, warm expression, creating deep creases at the corners of his eyes. He remarked in a quiet, measured tone that it was exceedingly rare to find hands that knew the true dignity of actual labor in a room suffocating under the weight of inherited wealth. He recognized the friction burns of a worker. He respected the physical toll required to build something real. Patricia heard the quiet exchange. She let out a sharp, theatrical gasp of revulsion. She adjusted her silk wrap, pulling the expensive fabric tighter around her shoulders, as if my proximity might infect her with poverty. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. She announced to the small, gathered crowd that my calloused skin was nothing to admire. She declared I was the singular, profound disappointment of the Taylor bloodline. She called me a failure. She stated I spent my days driving a filthy garbage truck while the rest of the family dedicated their lives to building a respectable societal legacy. She needed the surrounding politicians and investors to know I was a biological anomaly, an outcast she refused to claim. The older gentleman did not react to the venom. He finished dabbing the lingering moisture from his ruined suit jacket. He handed the damp cloth to a passing waiter. He looked at Patricia. His expression shifted from warm appreciation to mild clinical observation. He studied her the way a seasoned biologist might observe a predictable toxic insect. He found her hostility boring. He turned his attention back to me, ignoring her existence entirely. He offered a slight deferential bow of his head. He thanked me for the swift assistance and wished me a pleasant remainder of the evening. He adjusted his jacket, turned on his heel, and walked away, blending seamlessly back into the sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. As he pivoted, a specific glint of metal caught the overhead illumination. It was a small, discreet lapel pin, fastened securely to his left collar. My breath hitched, trapping the oxygen in my throat. I recognized the insignia instantly. The pin featured a stylized silver compass rose enclosed within a dark geometric hexagon. It was not a decorative fashion accessory or a generic charity ribbon. It was the exclusive executive crest of the premier infrastructure holding company on the Eastern Seaboard. The pin was issued only to the highest-ranking board members of the exact monolithic entity Derek was currently trying to woo. I stared at the retreating figure, connecting the structural dots of the evening. The modest older man was not a random local donor. He was not a venue manager. He was the apex of the corporate pyramid Derek desperately wanted to climb. He was the chairman. My mother had just publicly humiliated the singular individual holding their financial life support. She had treated the most powerful man in the state like a disposable servant. I realized the timeline for my retaliation just shifted into overdrive. Derek thought he possessed several hours to charm his way into a fraudulent contract. He actually had minutes. The trap was closing faster than anticipated, and the keynote presentation was about to begin. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. The sharp, metallic whine pierced the suffocating atmosphere of the crystal room. The localized acoustic feedback sliced through the lingering cocktail chatter, forcing the wealthy attendees to abandon their superficial conversations. The string quartet ceased playing abruptly, leaving a sudden, heavy silence hanging beneath the crystal chandeliers. The announcer adjusted his tuxedo lapel, projecting a practiced, booming voice across the venue. He welcomed the esteemed guests to the pinnacle event of the evening. He declared the upcoming keynote presentation would fundamentally alter the regional economic landscape. The largest infrastructure holding syndicate operating along the eastern seaboard was preparing to unveil its newly reorganized ownership hierarchy. This was the exact monolithic corporate entity Derek desperately pursued for his fraudulent logistics bailout. The air practically hummed with greedy anticipation. I turned my body, attempting to secure a clear line of sight toward the main stage. A dense shadow suddenly eclipsed the ambient overhead lighting. Harrison moved into my peripheral vision, executing a clumsy flanking maneuver. He utilized his broad shoulders to physically herd me away from the central tables, pushing my trajectory toward the heavy crimson drapes that concealed the kitchen service corridors. My older brother possessed a massive physical frame built during his prime collegiate rowing years. However, a decade of relentless alcohol consumption and zero professional ambition had softened his athletic build into bulky, sluggish mass. He survived entirely on a clandestine monthly stipend our mother siphoned from the rapidly depleting family trust. He lacked the basic intelligence required to navigate complex financial betrayals, leaving him to rely entirely on crude intimidation tactics whenever he felt threatened. Tonight, the sheer volume of high-profile executives clearly amplified his deep-seated inadequacies. He cornered me against the dark oak wainscoting where the brilliant ballroom illumination failed to penetrate. His face displayed a mottled, chaotic flush brought on by severe anxiety and excessive bourbon consumption. His breathing arrived in jagged, uneven intervals, puffing sour fumes into the confined space between us. He leaned forward, dropping his vocal register into a hostile, abrasive whisper. He commanded me to vacate the building immediately. He stated I had already caused enough secondary embarrassment by existing near the wealthy patrons. He gestured erratically toward the distant emergency exit glowing red above the service door. He demanded I utilize the rear alleyway route, ensuring none of the arriving billionaire investors witnessed my departure. He labeled my sensible charcoal blazer and practical demeanor as inherently trashy. He insisted my mere physical presence threatened to derail the impending lucrative partnerships his brother-in-law was actively negotiating. I remained planted firmly against the wooden paneling, offering zero ground. I informed him I had every legal right to attend a public charity function. I suggested he focus his limited cognitive resources on his own crumbling social standing instead of monitoring my movements. My refusal shattered his fragile restraint. Harrison lunged forward, crossing a definitive, dangerous threshold. His large right hand clamped down violently over my left bicep. The aggressive motion compressed the fabric of my jacket, driving his thick fingers deep into the underlying muscle tissue. It was a blatant physical escalation, designed to provoke terror and force immediate compliance. He expected me to flinch. He anticipated tears or a frantic, desperate struggle that he could easily overpower. I did not exhibit a single microscopic twitch of fear. I maintained a chillingly calm exterior, locking my gaze directly onto his bloodshot eyes. I allowed a heavy, frozen silence to stretch between us, while his grip remained locked onto my arm. I analyzed the specific mechanics of his hold, noting the overextended angle of his thumb and the sloppy positioning of his wrist. I initiated a rapid countermaneuver. I dropped my center of gravity slightly, generating upward leverage, while simultaneously rotating my shoulder inward. I brought my opposite hand up, executing a precise, targeted strike against the vulnerable radial nerve running along his forearm. The sharp, sudden application of localized pain caused an involuntary muscle spasm within his hand. His fingers instantly released their crushing grip. I stepped laterally, securing a dominant tactical stance. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion, delivering my ultimatum with the cold, sterile precision of a surgical scalpel. I warned him never to initiate unauthorized physical contact with my person ever again. I explained in graphic anatomical detail that if he attempted another violent grab, I would systematically shatter his radial bone and ensure he departed the gala strapped to a paramedic gurney. Harrison stumbled backward, his heavy leather shoes scraping loudly against the marble tile. He clutched his stinging forearm, rubbing the bruised nerve cluster with genuine shock. The aggressive bully facade completely evaporated, revealing the terrified, inadequate boy hiding underneath. He was visibly unnerved, deeply unsettled, by the absolute void of hesitation in my eyes. He realized he was no longer dealing with the quiet, submissive sibling he tormented during our childhood. He attempted to salvage his shattered pride by straightening his wrinkled suit jacket. He pasted a pathetic, trembling sneer across his flushed face. He pointed a shaking finger toward the brightly illuminated central stage. The Master of Ceremonies had just announced the introduction of the legendary Charity Chairman. The crowd erupted into thunderous, rhythmic applause. Harrison leaned slightly forward, keeping a safe physical distance. He mocked my current socioeconomic status, claiming I was a permanent resident of the gutter. He boasted that the approaching keynote address would finally expose my monumental failures. He told me to keep my eyes glued to the podium so I could finally witness exactly what real American success looked like. He spun around, retreating into the safety of the cheering crowd. He left me standing in the shadows, brushing a single wrinkle from my sleeve. I turned my attention toward the center stage, perfectly aligned with his mocking directive. I was absolutely ready to watch the definition of success take the microphone. The regional chairman stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, stepping directly into the glaring white spotlight. The applause reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating the crystal glasses resting on the nearby tables. The man approaching the podium was not a stranger. He wore a modest, unbranded charcoal suit that lacked the ostentatious tailoring favored by the surrounding socialites. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, catching the harsh stage illumination. It was the same elderly gentleman from the silent auction, the identical individual my mother had just viciously berated for spilling champagne. The man possessing the silver compass lapel pin, signifying total, absolute control over the monolithic holding company. I watched him adjust the microphone stand with a calm, practiced grace. He surveyed the expansive room, his intelligent eyes scanning the sea of desperate, wealthy faces. Derek sat in the front row, grinning like a victorious predator, entirely unaware he was staring directly at his own executioner. The ultimate authority figure overseeing the entire Eastern Seaboard logistics network now held the floor. My corporate trap was fully constructed. The bait was swallowed, and the fatal spring was primed to release. All that remained was for the chairman to speak my name. The Master of Ceremonies stepped away from the microphone stand, allowing the heavy, expectant silence to stretch across the massive ballroom. The thick velvet curtain parted, revealing the legendary figure of Elias Thorne. He walked toward the center stage with a slow, deliberate cadence that demanded absolute attention from every patron in the room. He did not possess the frantic, desperate energy of the younger corporate executives who previously populated the podium. His physical presence carried the immense gravitational weight of a man who had survived decades of brutal economic warfare. He adjusted the silver microphone, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the suffocating anxiety radiating from the front row VIP tables. Elias Thorne was not a product of inherited family wealth or elite university networking. He constructed his maritime empire entirely from scratch during the severe industrial recessions of the late 20th century. He started his career organizing rusted shipping containers on the frozen municipal docks, learning the intricate mechanics of global supply chains through grueling physical labor. He detested the modern iteration of corporate leadership that prioritized hollow marketing presentations over actual operational integrity. He shared a profound mutual respect with me because he knew I spent my formative years holding a metal clipboard in the freezing, pouring rain, inspecting freight manifests, while my siblings squandered our family trust at exclusive country clubs. We spoke the same native language of diesel fuel and raw cargo tonnage. From my concealed vantage point near the dark service corridors, I observed the catastrophic psychological collapse occurring at the primary seating arrangement. The color drained from my mother with a violent suddenness, leaving her face a stark, horrifying white. Patricia sat completely frozen in her expensive emerald gown, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the crisp linen tablecloth. She applied enough downward pressure to turn her delicate knuckles translucent. The devastating realization crashed over her like a physical, crushing blow. The elderly gentleman she had just viciously berated, the man she publicly degraded as incompetent, clumsy staff, was the absolute titan of Delaware commerce. She had demanded the immediate termination of the singular financial architect her family desperately needed to survive the night. Beside her, Victoria unraveled with a frantic kinetic energy. My sister possessed a sharp analytical cruelty, perfectly suited for domestic manipulation, but entirely inadequate for genuine corporate crisis management. She dug into her designer evening clutch, retrieving a heavy gold tube of lipstick. She applied the crimson color with erratic, trembling strokes, desperately attempting to assemble a protective mask of unbothered composure. She leaned toward her husband, issuing a harsh, venomous whisper. She commanded him to immediately formulate a strategy to spin the disastrous encounter and salvage the impending contract negotiation. Derek could not process her frantic, urgent demands. My brother-in-law was experiencing a spectacular internal structural failure. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the stage spotlights illuminated the rapid deterioration of his carefully fabricated confidence. A thick layer of cold sweat coated his forehead, catching the ambient illumination of the ballroom. The moisture gathered along his brow, tracking down his face and soaking into the starched white collar of his expensive custom shirt. His rich brown complexion, usually vibrant and carefully maintained, took on a sickly, ashen gray pallor. The tailored seams of his jacket seemed to constrict around his broad chest, transforming the luxury garment into a suffocating trap. He knew his entire corporate survival depended entirely on securing a contract with this specific entity, and his mother-in-law had just poured shattered glass and spilled alcohol over their only viable lifeline. Elias leaned closer to the silver microphone stand. He did not retrieve a stack of prepared index cards or rely upon a glowing digital teleprompter. He spoke directly from a deep reservoir of authentic lived experience. His voice resonated through the silent venue, carrying a low, gravelly authority that commanded unwavering focus. He began his address by honoring the foundational roots of American logistics. He painted a vivid auditory picture of the working-class individuals who built the national infrastructure, highlighting the relentless, unyielding grit required to maintain the global supply chain. He praised the calloused hands that secured heavy cargo ratchets and the exhausted transport drivers navigating treacherous coastal weather systems. He specifically referenced the historic deep-water ports of Sussex County, describing the coastal region as the vital, beating heart of the eastern seaboard economy. The precise geographic reference served as a subtle, invisible tether connecting his current public address directly back to the vintage maritime map from the earlier silent auction. It was a deliberate, brilliant homage to the exact 50-acre parcel of land my family was currently attempting to steal through federal wire fraud. Then the tone of his address shifted, plunging the ambient temperature of the room into an icy, absolute abyss. Elias transitioned from honoring the industrial past to actively dismantling the fraudulent present. He aimed a brutal surgical strike directly at the modern corporate culture of hollow financial facades. He spoke with rising, passionate intensity about the severe dangers of utilizing excessive leverage to project a false illusion of massive wealth. He condemned the toxic, prevalent practice of building corporate empires upon unstable foundations of fraudulent collateral and predatory, desperate debt. Every single syllable landed with the devastating impact of an artillery shell, precisely targeting the hidden criminal enterprise managed by Derek. Elias dissected the exact financial anatomy of my brother-in-law and his collapsing Ponzi scheme without ever uttering a single specific name. He criticized weak, cowardly executives who valued the superficial appearance of success over the generation of actual sustainable revenue. He condemned the pathetic reliance on forged legal documents and desperate secret collateralization to mask severe operational bankruptcy. Derek swallowed hard, his throat working erratically against his tight collar. He reached a trembling hand toward his crystal water goblet. His fingers shook with such violent intensity that the ice cubes rattled loudly against the fragile glass rim, echoing in the quiet space surrounding his table. The surrounding audience of wealthy donors and local politicians nodded along with the powerful, poignant speech, completely oblivious to the localized psychological execution occurring at the very front of the room. Throughout the devastating monologue, Elias maintained a masterful physical command of the stage, yet his visual focus repeatedly drifted away from the sea of wealthy VIPs and elected officials. Every few minutes, his intelligent eyes tracked across the vast expanse of the ballroom, cutting through the heavy darkness to find my isolated position near the kitchen service doors. He offered a series of brief, almost imperceptible, respectful nods. They were silent, physical gestures of profound professional deference, acknowledging the true, absolute power structure hidden entirely within the room. Harrison noticed the repeated directional shifts of the chairman and his gaze. My older brother squinted into the dark shadows, his drunken, abrasive bravado entirely replaced by raw, primal confusion. He could not comprehend why the most powerful titan of regional industry kept looking toward the dark corner he had just deemed a trashy embarrassment. The tension stretched tight across the room until it threatened to snap the structural pillars of the luxury venue. Elias gripped the wooden edges of the podium, pausing to let his heavy statement settle permanently over the captive crowd. He announced that the volatile landscape of American commerce required a new, ruthless breed of leadership to properly navigate the impending economic turbulence. He declared his immediate intention to step down from his executive role, relinquishing all operational and public authority over the massive syndicate. He informed the silent, stunned audience that he was yielding total, absolute control of the multi-billion-dollar holding company directly to its primary architect. He prepared to introduce the silent managing partner, the singular individual holding the absolute majority equity stake in the entire enterprise. The echo of the amplified microphone gradually dissolved into the vast vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom. The resulting atmosphere was entirely devoid of comfort. It transformed into a heavy, pressurized vacuum. The wealthy patrons, the elite power brokers, and the influential local politicians sat immobilized at their lavishly decorated tables. The sudden, monumental shift in regional economic dynamics paralyzed them. The explicit revelation regarding an unknown silent managing partner possessing total control over the paramount infrastructure syndicate sent violent shockwaves through the gathered assembly. The air smelled sharply of oxidized silver melting candle wax and an overwhelming undercurrent of raw human anxiety. From my isolated, tactical vantage point near the swinging wooden kitchen doors, I observed the spectacular unfolding psychological disaster. The elaborate corporate architecture of my logistics empire remained a fiercely guarded, secure secret. I dedicated the previous 5 grueling years to quietly assembling the massive holding company, burying the true ownership behind impenetrable, dense layers of international legal trusts. I did not achieve this structural victory alone. My brother-in-law possessed a younger sister named Maya. She operated as a brilliant corporate tax attorney based in a modest brick office down in Baltimore. Maya harbored a profound disgust for Derek and his continuous parade of fraudulent business endeavors. She recognized my genuine operational expertise very early in my career. Maya meticulously drafted the initial protective shell documents, ensuring my rapidly expanding maritime revenue remained completely severed from the toxic, draining reach of my mother and the crumbling family estate. She understood the critical necessity of operational stealth. We quietly constructed an impenetrable financial fortress while my arrogant blood relatives aggressively mocked my practical work boots and stained hands. Down at the very front of the venue, the primary VIP seating arrangement descended into a state of severe terminal denial. The primal biological instinct for immediate survival temporarily overrode their profound public humiliation. They collectively stubbornly refused to accept the terrifying reality that the ultimate regional authority figure had just dismantled their primary avenue of salvation. Patricia initiated the desperate offensive countermaneuver. She pushed her heavy wooden chair backward, causing the ornately carved legs to scrape loudly against the polished marble floor. She leaned across the pristine white linen tablecloth and commanded her immediate family to instantly assemble a united, impenetrable front. Derek and Harrison followed her urgent, hissed directive without a single moment of hesitation. The three desperate individuals rose in sudden, chaotic unison, forming a physical human barricade directly adjacent to the primary stage staircase. They plastered frantic, wide, artificial smiles across their pale, terrified faces. Their rapidly blinking eyes projected a deeply unsettling mixture of predatory financial hunger and sheer panic. They clearly intended to physically intercept the departing chairman the exact second his polished leather shoes made contact with the main ballroom floor. They foolishly, sincerely believed a firm, aggressive handshake combined with an overwhelming display of fabricated aristocratic charm could somehow magically erase the preceding hour of monumental personal insults. Derek calculated that this physical interception was his final opportunity to secure the lucrative bailout contract he required to successfully evade a lengthy federal prison sentence. A young, exhausted catering assistant unfortunately happened to be clearing a nearby auxiliary table, holding a heavy silver serving tray loaded precariously with empty crystal champagne flutes. The employee stepped backward, blindly attempting to safely navigate the incredibly narrow space existing between the towering floral arrangements. Patricia immediately recognized this minor physical obstruction, blocking her intended strategic path. My mother did not issue a polite verbal request or offer a basic courteous warning. She simply extended her right arm and viciously shoved the young waitress aside. The unexpected, forceful impact sent the vulnerable catering assistant stumbling backward into the heavy velvet stage drapery. Several fragile crystal glasses tipped over the raised edge of the silver tray, falling and shattering violently onto the hard stone floor. Patricia completely ignored the destructive, chaotic noise. She ruthlessly secured her primary position at the very front of the interception line, smoothing the fabric of her expensive emerald gown with trembling, frantic hands. Elias Thorne slowly descended the short, carpeted wooden staircase, utilizing steady, confident, measured steps. He absolutely did not rush his movements. He advanced with the calm, deliberate, terrifying purpose of a seasoned veteran commander who routinely directed massive naval fleets and heavily regulated, lucrative international trade routes. The surrounding dense crowd of wealthy donors and influential local politicians instinctively parted, creating a remarkably clear avenue through the suffocating sea of tailored, expensive suits and flowing designer evening gowns. The localized ambient oxygen supplies suddenly seemed to evaporate as the powerful chairman approached the designated front tables. Derek took a bold, aggressive step forward, moving his large frame directly into the center of the newly formed pathway. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket remained visibly darkly stained with the undeniable evidence of his severe nervous perspiration. He forcefully extended his right arm outward, initiating the universal, desperate corporate gesture of forced networking. His jaw opened, preparing to rapidly launch into an entirely fabricated sales pitch, specifically designed to secure his immediate financial salvation. He stood fully prepared to sacrifice whatever tiny, lingering, microscopic shreds of personal dignity he still possessed, just to successfully salvage his rapidly collapsing logistics empire. Elias Thorne absolutely did not break his smooth, consistent stride. He did not slow his forward momentum by even a single, minuscule, fractional increment. He simply continued his steady walking pace, completely ignoring the desperate, physical, human barricade deliberately obstructing his intended trajectory. He did not offer a polite, subtle nod of refusal or even a quick, dismissive sideways glance. He treated my cruel mother, my violent older brother, and my fraudulent brother-in-law as if they were entirely invisible, odorless, gaseous entities. He walked straight, directly past their tightly formed formation, efficiently stripping them of their absolute, final, remaining, pathetic illusion of elevated societal importance. Derek remained standing, rigidly frozen, his right arm hanging remarkably awkwardly suspended in the empty, dead air. The fabricated, highly confident smile instantly, violently melted off his sweaty face, leaving behind a raw expression of pure, unadulterated, primal terror. The supreme regional power broker had just publicly, mercilessly rendered him entirely obsolete. The collective, captivated gaze of 500 absolutely silent elite guests closely tracked the chairman as he steadily navigated away from the brightly, glaringly illuminated center dais. He moved purposefully, directly toward the much darker perimeter of the expansive venue. He confidently entered the heavy, obscuring shadows cast by the massive, decorative architectural pillars, leaving the glamorous, highly coveted VIP section far behind him in the bright lights. The quiet, nervous chatter that had slowly begun to cautiously rise immediately died away once again. The massive ballroom collectively held its breath, functioning entirely as a single, terrified, paralyzed organism. They intently watched the legendary titan of local industry march steadily toward the unassuming kitchen access corridors. I remained perfectly still, standing right beside my small, unadorned, isolated table. I did not nervously adjust my sensible charcoal blazer or attempt to anxiously smooth my pulled-back hair. I maintained a posture of total stone stillness while I watched Elias traverse the final 20 yards separating us. He finally stopped squarely directly in front of my small location. The suffocating silence trapped within the massive room achieved a terrifying, absolutely breathless zenith. The invisible, intricate steel trap I had spent years building had officially, finally, snapped permanently shut. The heavy vacuum occupying the grand ballroom shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. 500 individual heads turned in a single synchronized motion, creating a massive rustling wave of expensive silk and tailored wool. The collective attention of the entire wealthy assembly violently pivoted away from the brightly illuminated center stage and aggressively focused directly upon my dark, isolated corner. The physical weight of their unified gaze felt like a tangible atmospheric pressure pushing against the remaining oxygen in the room. The local politicians, the elite power brokers, and the desperate corporate executives strained their necks attempting to peer into the deep shadows near the kitchen access doors. They desperately wanted to see the mysterious apex predator who secretly controlled the massive economic engine of their region. Elias Thorne remained perfectly stationary in front of my small, unadorned table. He did not seem bothered by the hundreds of eyes suddenly boring into his back. He maintained his focus exclusively on my seated figure. We shared a silent, profound acknowledgement of the grueling decade we had spent meticulously building this exact moment. We had systematically constructed an invisible financial labyrinth, utilizing the brilliant legal strategies developed by Maya. Maya was Derek's younger sister, an incredibly gifted African-American corporate tax attorney operating out of a modest brick building down in Baltimore. She harbored a deep-seated resentment toward her arrogant brother and his endless string of fraudulent operations. Maya recognized my genuine operational intellect years ago and chose to secretly align her legal expertise with my maritime ambition. She flawlessly executed the complex international trust documents that allowed me to conquer the shipping industry while remaining entirely undetected by my abusive relatives. The esteemed chairman finally broke the suffocating silence. He executed a slow, deliberate bowing motion with his head. It was not a gesture of subservient weakness or quiet surrender. It was a formal, public display of profound professional reverence, delivered from one industrial titan to another. He straightened his posture and projected his deep, gravelly voice across the frozen venue, ensuring every single syllable resonated clearly into the furthest corners of the expansive room. He loudly addressed me, utilizing my official supreme corporate title. He called me Madam Chief Executive Officer. The two words struck the opulent environment like a pair of heavy brass bells. He respectfully inquired if I was properly prepared to walk forward and formally address my newly assembled board of directors. The psychological impact of that specific formal title practically detonated upon the primary VIP table. The raw devastation rippled through my blood relatives like a violent electrical current. They had spent the entire evening loudly broadcasting my supposed monumental failures to any local donor who would listen. They had aggressively labeled me a pathetic driver and a tragic biological embarrassment. The catastrophic collision between their fabricated, insulting narrative and the undeniable, terrifying reality caused their cognitive functions to misfire completely. I felt zero internal pressure to rush my response. I possessed total dominion over the timeline. I slowly reached across the crisp white linen covering my small table. My fingers wrapped around the cool, damp exterior of my crystal water goblet. I lifted the heavy glass, bringing it steadily to my lips. I took a long, deliberate, calm sip of the chilled liquid. I allowed the agonizing seconds to stretch and multiply, maximizing the psychological torture inflicted upon the people who had maliciously stolen my inheritance. Across the massive ballroom, I could clearly see the visceral, horrifying shock dismantling Victoria. My younger sister stood near the main staircase, looking like a fragile porcelain doll dropped onto solid concrete. Her jaw literally dropped open, abandoning any pretense of aristocratic composure. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, terrified white. Resting against her pale, trembling collarbone was the antique sapphire pendant she had maliciously manipulated out of my personal safe. Under the harsh, glaring light of the crystal chandeliers, the priceless stolen gemstone lost its majestic ocean glow. Surrounded by the terrifying reality of my supreme wealth, the necklace looked like a cheap, worthless piece of colored glass. It transformed from a triumphant symbol of her cruel victory into a heavy, visible shackle, binding her to my ultimate mercy. Patricia experienced a similar catastrophic breakdown. The arrogant sneer permanently etched onto her face dissolved into a mask of ugly, raw panic. She clutched the fabric of her emerald gown with trembling, desperate fingers. The terrifying realization that she had just spent an hour publicly degrading the absolute owner of the dominant regional infrastructure company crashed over her fragile ego. Harrison stood beside her, blinking his bloodshot eyes in rapid succession. The alcohol-fueled bravado that had motivated his earlier physical assault evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. I placed the empty water goblet back onto the table. The quiet click of the crystal contacting the wood echoed sharply. I stood up from my chair. I ran my hands down the lapels of my sensible charcoal blazer, executing a casual, unbothered straightening motion. My clothing lacked a designer label or expensive silk embroidery, but I wore this simple garment like an impenetrable suit of armor. I stepped forward, moving out of the obscuring shadows and directly into the ambient glow of the peripheral lighting. Derek could no longer process the horrific unfolding scenario. His brain violently rejected the impossible truth standing right before him. He abandoned his strategic interception position near the stage stairs. He stumbled a few clumsy steps toward the center aisle, his custom leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble tile. He opened his mouth, attempting to forcefully interject himself into the historic, monumental transfer of power. He called out my given name, projecting a pathetic, trembling sound that lacked his usual smooth, persuasive baritone. His vocal cords sounded tight and constricted by sheer panic. He loudly questioned the nature of my professional relationship with the powerful chairman. He practically begged for confirmation, asking if I somehow miraculously worked for Mr. Thorne. He clung violently to a final pathetic delusion, hoping I was merely a highly competent administrative assistant or an obscure middle management employee. He needed me to remain a subordinate, to maintain the illusion of his own fraudulent superiority. Elias Thorne did not allow the desperate, fraudulent businessman to dictate the narrative for even a single fraction of a second. The older gentleman rotated his shoulders, fixing Derek with a cold, surgical, predatory stare. The chairman wielded his voice like a perfectly sharpened scalpel, slicing effortlessly through the thick layer of lies my brother-in-law utilized to survive. He sternly corrected the frantic man. He explicitly addressed him as Mr. Lawson, stripping away any false sense of warmth or familiarity. He declared with absolute, terrifying clarity that the monolithic Taylor Maritime Trust owned the entire holding company. He paused, letting the massive, multi-billion-dollar reality settle heavily over the silent room. Then he delivered the final, lethal verbal blow. He plainly stated that he did not employ me. He confirmed to the entire wealthy assembly that he worked exclusively for her. The final declaration obliterated the remaining structural pillars of Derek and his fragile, fraudulent empire. The man realized with devastating certainty that the mysterious, dominant entity he had spent weeks begging for an emergency financial bailout was entirely controlled by the sister he had ruthlessly plotted to destroy. The massive debt obligations, the forged collateral notes, and the impending federal bank seizures were now firmly locked inside my closed fist. I stepped past the elderly chairman, offering him a brief nod of mutual respect. I began my slow, deliberate march toward the brightly illuminated center stage. The dense crowd of wealthy patrons silently, instinctively parted before me, creating a wide, respectful path. I did not look back, but I could clearly hear the frantic, chaotic scrambling happening directly behind me. My mother, my sister, my brother, and my brother-in-law stumbled over themselves, desperately rushing to follow my trajectory. They moved like terrified, helpless animals caught in a burning forest. They finally realized, with crushing clarity, that their entire lavish existence, their homes, their cars, their social status, and their physical freedom were now entirely owned by the woman they had betrayed. I approached the wooden staircase leading up to the microphone. The path to ultimate revenge was perfectly paved, but a new obstacle immediately materialized. Standing firmly at the top of the platform was a severe-looking group of legacy investors. Their tailored suits were immaculate, and their expressions were hostile. They represented the old guard of the maritime industry, men who despised change and loathed the idea of a young female operator dismantling their comfortable monopolies. The lead investor crossed his arms, physically blocking the podium. His presence signaled a vicious, impending battle for board control. I took a deep breath of the chilled ballroom air. The family war was officially won, but the brutal corporate slaughter was only just beginning. The severe legacy investor firmly maintained his defensive position at the very top of the wooden stage stairs. His tailored navy suit projected an unmistakable aura of archaic coastal authority and outdated entitlement. He represented the crumbling foundation of the regional shipping monopolies that once dominated the eastern seaboard. He generated his initial massive wealth during the late 20th century, utilizing aggressive labor intimidation tactics and entirely unregulated diesel vessels. I built my modern logistical empire entirely differently. I utilized highly encrypted digital data streams, massive international shell corporations, and absolutely ruthless operational efficiency to conquer the global market. He aggressively crossed his arms, forming a deliberate physical barrier between my advancing figure and the silver microphone stand. I did not alter my forward momentum or display any hesitation. I simply paused upon the penultimate step, maintaining a posture of absolute calm superiority. I softly informed the hostile man that my private financial trust currently controlled a commanding 70% of all corporate voting shares. I calmly reminded the arrogant executive that any deliberate physical obstruction of the chief executive constituted a severe, actionable breach of fiduciary duty under state corporate law. I watched the ugly, angry realization dawn across his deeply wrinkled features. He slowly lowered his arms while his face flushed with deeply suppressed humiliation. He stepped aside, granting me unimpeded access to the wooden podium. His hateful, piercing glare practically guaranteed he would immediately begin organizing a vicious, hostile proxy battle before the upcoming fiscal quarter concluded. I stepped up to the podium and smoothly adjusted the slender metallic microphone stand. The entire grand ballroom remained securely trapped within a profound, suffocating silence. 500 incredibly influential patrons held their collective breath, waiting anxiously for my opening statement. I did not raise my voice or project any arrogant, triumphant emotion. I completely refused to publicly gloat over my thoroughly defeated blood relatives. I simply delivered a masterful, understated address regarding the fundamental economic reality of our shared industrial sector. I began by describing the immense inherent value of genuine physical assets. I praised the undeniable resilient strength of heavy steel cargo ships, massive concrete loading docks, and incredibly reliable diesel transport locomotives. I vividly contrasted those tangible, powerful resources against the highly toxic, fragile nature of leveraged lies. I explained how many contemporary business operators constructed massive corporate entities that functioned exactly like hollow, decaying wooden structures. They spent millions of dollars constantly painting their exterior walls with expensive, misleading public relations campaigns, while completely ignoring the severe financial rot rapidly devouring their internal structural framework. I expertly guided the narrative toward the specific, incredibly dangerous practices currently plaguing the local market. I systematically dismantled the exact fraudulent business model utilized by my desperate brother-in-law without ever explicitly stating his actual name. Derek had spent the past decade aggressively manipulating regional banking institutions by constantly projecting a carefully fabricated illusion of massive generational wealth. He utilized extremely sophisticated counterfeit shipping invoices and entirely phantom warehouse inventory reports to secure incredibly large unsecured commercial loans. His entire sprawling logistical enterprise survived purely upon predatory high-interest credit and continuous desperate borrowing. I informed the captivated wealthy audience that our newly reorganized holding company was actively implementing an immediate, uncompromising, zero-tolerance corporate policy regarding all external partnerships. I detailed the incredibly severe, sweeping consequences awaiting any entity discovered engaging in systemic vendor fraud. I clearly articulated the absolute legal destruction facing anyone foolish enough to utilize stolen familial property as false financial collateral. My cold, calculated gaze slowly swept across the massive, sprawling sea of wealthy, terrified attendees. I allowed my eyes to finally settle upon the primary formal seating arrangement located directly beneath the illuminated stage. I locked my vision precisely onto the sweating, panicked face of my brother-in-law. I deliberately and flawlessly enunciated the specific heavy word, forgery. The raw vocal impact struck him like a massive physical blow directly to his chest. Derek instantly collapsed backward into his ornately carved wooden dining chair. His spinal column seemed to completely lose all structural integrity in a single terrifying moment. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket suddenly hung incredibly loosely across his violently slumping shoulders. A sickly, horrifying gray hue washed rapidly over his face, entirely replacing his previously vibrant, healthy complexion. His jaw hung slightly open as he desperately struggled to adequately process the sheer magnitude of his impending, absolute doom. He finally fully understood that I possessed absolute, concrete, documented knowledge of his highly illegal real estate maneuvers and his incredibly desperate, fraudulent property transfers. I smoothly shifted the focus of my public address toward our broader macroeconomic expansion strategy. I revealed a carefully guarded, massive corporate secret that would permanently alter the entire coastal economy. I proudly announced that our massive logistical syndicate had recently engaged in a highly aggressive, incredibly quiet, regional acquisition phase. We specifically targeted the highly distressed, crippling liabilities belonging to the most volatile regional transport providers. I plainly stated that our Supreme Maritime Trust officially purchased all outstanding promissory notes and massive delinquent commercial mortgages currently circulating within the local sector. I clarified the terrifying new reality for any struggling vendor presently sitting within the opulent room. They were no longer standing in a supportive position to negotiate a highly lucrative partnership with our wealthy board of directors. They were now directly and permanently answering to their sole, uncompromising owner. They answered exclusively to me. The vast, beautiful ballroom remained completely and entirely deadly silent. Every single influential, wealthy guest hung desperately onto every solitary word leaving my lips. The absolute regional power dynamic had completely inverted within a matter of mere terrifying minutes. My family members sat perfectly frozen in their expensive formal attire, resembling pathetic ruined statues crumbling under immense invisible gravitational pressure. My mother frantically clutched her green emerald gown, while my violent older brother stared blankly at the polished marble floor. My younger sister looked incredibly physically sick, her hands shaking violently in her lap. I delivered the final, devastating, absolute blow to their carefully fabricated, luxurious existence. I formally announced a comprehensive, immediate, forensic financial audit encompassing every single external operator currently interacting with our expansive network. I declared the complete, instantaneous, permanent cancellation of all pending vendor contracts effective immediately at the stroke of midnight. The massive, crucial financial lifeline sustaining my treacherous relatives was now officially, permanently severed. They currently possessed absolutely zero remaining revenue streams and completely exhausted all available local credit. They were entirely, catastrophically bankrupt and completely, publicly exposed. The logical, inevitable conclusion of extreme corporate debt in modern American society dictates that severe, unavoidable consequences always eventually arrive to violently collect their due balance. Just as I formally concluded my powerful speech, the heavy, ornate mahogany doors located at the far rear of the expansive ballroom violently swung open. A highly coordinated tactical team of serious armed men wearing dark, matching navy windbreakers marched purposefully into the opulent venue. Their sudden, aggressive presence introduced a chilling, terrifying new atmosphere to the gala. They did not look like wealthy local investors or friendly neighborhood politicians. They carried incredibly thick, heavy leather document folders and proudly wore shiny silver enforcement badges securely clipped to their leather belts. The federal authorities had officially arrived to execute the massive criminal warrants quietly generated by my extensive private financial investigation. My family was no longer simply facing immense social humiliation and total complete financial ruin. They were now actively confronting the terrifying, immediate prospect of lengthy federal physical incarceration. I stepped down from the wooden stage while organized chaos rapidly consumed the expansive grand ballroom. The disciplined tactical enforcement agents began systematically securing every single exterior exit. I ignored the rising panic unfolding across the primary floor and moved purposefully toward the secluded enclave located directly behind the main platform. The private VIP lounge possessed incredibly thick soundproof walls and massive carved mahogany doors. My terrified relatives practically sprinted behind me, desperately pushing their way into the quiet, isolated chamber before the federal authorities completely locked down the entire surrounding perimeter. The opulent interior of the hidden room featured rich crimson velvet seating arrangements and heavy crystal beverage decanters resting upon polished brass tables. The luxurious environment created a striking, brutal contrast against the profound internal psychological decay currently destroying my family. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, temporarily severing us from the public disaster occurring outside. The ambient noise vanished, replaced entirely by the frantic, ragged breathing of 4 completely ruined individuals. My mother initiated her desperate psychological pivot almost immediately. Patricia possessed a terrifying, lifelong ability to completely rewrite historical facts whenever objective reality threatened her fragile social standing. During our childhood, whenever my aggressive older sibling Harrison failed a fundamental academic requirement, she instantly blamed the educational institution and entirely fabricated a complex narrative regarding his supposedly misunderstood genius. She actively applied this exact same toxic manipulative skill to my monumental corporate victory. She plastered a sickeningly sweet artificial smile onto her aging, wrinkled face. She stepped aggressively forward, falsely claiming she inherently possessed unwavering faith in my industrial destiny since my birth. She shamelessly stated they always secretly knew I was quietly building something magnificent and simply utilized harsh criticism to properly motivate my ultimate success. I refused to entertain her pathetic, deranged delusions for even a single fraction of a second. I stared directly into her deceitful eyes, maintaining an expression of frozen stone. The sheer audacity required to claim intentional credit for the empire I constructed while they continuously abused me was genuinely staggering. She recognized the cold, unbreakable rejection radiating from my posture, and her artificial smile faltered, slowly sliding off her face like melting wax. Derek aggressively shoved his way past Victoria, desperately attempting to seize control of the rapidly deteriorating narrative. His custom-tailored garments were destroyed by severe nervous perspiration. He frantically attempted to minimize his catastrophic financial crimes. He weakly labeled his criminal forgery as a simple, minor domestic misunderstanding. He pleaded for basic familial loyalty, loudly invoking his legal marriage to my younger sister as a protective shield. He promised we could easily resolve the banking discrepancies internally without involving the hostile government regulators waiting outside. I calmly reached into the interior pocket of my sensible charcoal blazer and retrieved my cellular device. I illuminated the bright digital display and opened a highly specific forwarded electronic message. Maya sent this exact correspondence to my secure server early yesterday morning. Maya was my brilliant African-American sister-in-law, an incredibly gifted corporate tax attorney operating out of Baltimore. She harbored a profound disgust for her arrogant brother and his continuous parade of fraudulent operations. Maya thoroughly reviewed his falsified collateral deeds and recognized his sloppy digital tampering immediately. I held the glowing screen directly in front of his panicked, darting eyes, forcing him to read the devastating legal conclusions drafted by his own blood relative. I proceeded to explain the brutal geographical and commercial reality concerning the Sussex parcel. My family always viewed that specific plot of coastal land as a barren, worthless swamp, something to be easily stolen and quickly leveraged for fast cash. I spent 7 grueling years quietly dredging the muddy basin, securing complex environmental zoning permits, laying thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, and constructing massive automated crane systems. That location was not a simple piece of vacant property waiting for residential development. It functioned as a fully operational 50-acre maritime deep-water port. The facility accommodated massive international cargo vessels and served as the paramount central dispatch hub for my $500 million logistical syndicate. Every single physical asset moving through the eastern seaboard eventually passed through the exact geographic choke point he foolishly attempted to mortgage. By intentionally altering my signature upon those specific commercial loan applications, he did not just cheat a naive younger sibling. He committed massive, deliberate wire fraud against a heavily protected international corporate entity. I informed him that his desperate actions automatically triggered mandatory felony reporting protocols with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The government agencies possessed complete, unredacted access to his entire fabricated financial history. He did not merely risk his fake public reputation. He guaranteed the immediate, total seizure of all his personal assets, the freezing of his domestic bank accounts, and the absolute destruction of his professional livelihood. He walked blindfolded into an inescapable, devastating legal trap, specifically designed to annihilate his fraudulent holding company. The stark, horrifying reality of his impending lengthy prison sentence finally registered within his brain, causing his knees to buckle slightly. I shifted my intense focus away from his collapsing form and looked directly at Victoria. My younger sister practically vibrated with pure, unadulterated terror. She spent her entire existence valuing superficial aesthetic beauty and stolen aristocratic status above basic human decency. I focused my gaze upon the stolen antique jewelry resting heavily against her pale collarbone. I demanded the immediate, permanent return of my rightful property. I explicitly ordered her to remove the priceless sapphire pendant right now. I did not raise my vocal volume, but my strict command carried the crushing weight of total, supreme authority. She did not attempt to argue or justify her previous malicious theft. She reached trembling, pale hands behind her neck. Her slender fingers shook violently as she clumsily fumbled with the intricate, delicate golden clasp. The heavy, ornate necklace finally broke free from her skin. She dropped the magnificent glowing gemstone directly into my waiting, open palm. The cool metal felt incredibly satisfying against my skin, representing the final physical reclamation of my stolen heritage. I slowly closed my fingers around the reclaimed sapphire and locked my vision onto my mother and my brother. Harrison remained completely silent, paralyzed by a potent mixture of residual expensive alcohol and overwhelming primal fear. My older brother always relied upon brute physical intimidation to dominate his environment, but his muscular frame proved useless against the weight of supreme corporate power. He recognized that his comfortable, lazy lifestyle, funded entirely by my previous hidden subsidies, was completely eradicated. I delivered my absolute final decree to the 3 people who systematically attempted to destroy my life. I stated with permanent finality that our biological connection was officially terminated. I declared them financially, socially, and legally severed from my existence forever. I promised they would never receive a single additional penny from my accounts, nor would they ever access any portion of the massive family trust I now entirely controlled. Just as the crushing, permanent reality of my decree settled heavily over their horrified, pale faces, the thick mahogany lounge doors violently swung open. The heavy, carved mahogany doors swung open with a muted, pressurized thud that seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the VIP lounge. I anticipated the loud, chaotic arrival of local municipal police officers, replete with heavy tactical gear and shouting voices. Such a disruptive spectacle would have fundamentally ruined the pristine high society image of the evening's charitable gala. Instead, the individuals stepping across the threshold moved with the terrifying, silent precision of an apex predator closing its jaws. They were not regional law enforcement. They were senior financial regulators representing the state of Delaware, accompanied by a highly disciplined squad of private corporate security contractors. My brilliant sister-in-law, Maya, had meticulously orchestrated this surgical strike from her Baltimore legal office. She understood that in the high-stakes realm of American commerce, federal and state financial regulators operated with a swift, merciless efficiency that traditional police departments simply could not match. The lead investigator stepped forward. He wore an immaculate, unbranded navy suit that projected an aura of absolute institutional authority. He held a thick, tightly bound legal portfolio constructed from heavy, cream-colored cardstock. He did not introduce himself, nor did he offer any pleasantries. He marched directly toward my trembling brother-in-law. The security personnel swiftly fanned out their imposing frames, effectively sealing the perimeter and blocking any potential avenue of escape. The atmosphere inside the soundproofed chamber grew incredibly dense, thick with the metallic scent of adrenaline and the sour stench of Derek's profound panic. The state official stopped mere inches from the defeated man, raised the thick legal document, and forcefully pressed it into Derek's sweaty, shaking hands. The official's voice was devoid of any emotion, a flat, mechanical drone that delivered a devastating legal mandate. He informed Derek that he was officially served with a comprehensive emergency cease and desist injunction order, authorized by the Delaware Court of Chancery. The papers detailed extensive, catastrophic allegations of severe corporate espionage, malicious vendor fraud, and the deliberate forgery of commercial collateral deeds. The investigator explained that these specific actions violated numerous foundational statutes governing interstate commerce and secure financial trading. Derek tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish pulled from the ocean, but his vocal cords simply refused to function. The sheer gravity of the state-sanctioned destruction crushed his remaining resistance into fine dust. The private security contractors smoothly moved into position, firmly grasping Derek by both of his upper arms. They executed the extraction protocol flawlessly. They did not drag him through the crowded grand ballroom, where hundreds of influential donors and media representatives still mingled. Doing so would have generated an uncontrollable public relations nightmare for the Maritime Syndicate. Instead, they spun him around and marched him toward a discreet, heavily concealed door located at the rear of the private lounge. This hidden access point led directly to the venue's industrial service elevator. This specific route was typically reserved for the removal of wet garbage, dirty catering linens, and discarded floral arrangements. The symbolic weight of this humiliating departure was unmistakable. The man who had spent the entire evening loudly boasting about his fabricated wealth and aristocratic connections was currently being forcibly ejected through the trash chute, removed from polite society like a piece of rotting debris. The reinforced metal door clicked firmly shut behind the departing security team, leaving the four of us trapped in a sudden, suffocating vacuum. The exact millisecond the immediate threat of law enforcement vanished, the fragile, toxic bonds holding my biological relatives together instantaneously dissolved. My mother, Patricia, had spent her entire adult life operating our family dynamic like a ruthless, high-risk hedge fund. She systematically assigned intrinsic value to her children based entirely upon our ability to generate social capital and financial leverage. For years, Victoria represented her most valuable performing asset, the beautiful, socially adept daughter who successfully married into supposed generational wealth. I was the underperforming, heavily shorted stock, the blue-collar embarrassment meant to be hidden away. Now with the fabricated loss in fortune exposed as a criminal illusion and the true maritime empire firmly under my control, Patricia initiated a brutal, instantaneous divestment strategy. She spun rapidly toward her youngest daughter. Her previously sweet, manipulative tone vanished, replaced by a vicious, venomous snarl. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at Victoria's face and unleashed a torrent of profound psychological abuse. She viciously blamed the sobbing young woman for her husband's catastrophic failures, screaming that Victoria was a naive, foolish girl who had deliberately dragged the entire family into a disgraceful, irredeemable scandal. Patricia claimed that a proper, intelligent wife would have recognized the financial rot and secured alternative funding before the collapse. Harrison eagerly joined the verbal slaughter. My older sibling always operated as an intellectual parasite, relying entirely upon the financial stipends generated by others to fund his excessive, lazy lifestyle. His face contorted into an ugly, flushed mask of raw fury. He aggressively stepped into Victoria's personal space, towering over her trembling frame. He brutally accused her of intentionally sabotaging his future, screaming about the lost allowance and the seized luxury vehicles he could no longer access. He called her a pathetic failure, echoing every single cruel insult they had collectively hurled at me for the past decade. They tore into her with the savage, unthinking ferocity of starving wolves fighting over a meager scrap of meat. Their supposed unconditional familial love was nothing more than a transactional mirage, evaporating the exact moment the monetary benefits ceased to exist. I stepped away from the horrifying domestic implosion and moved toward the heavy glass doors leading out onto the private VIP balcony. I pushed the polished brass handles and stepped outside into the crisp, cool evening air. The transition from the stifling, toxic lounge to the expansive, open night felt like stepping onto another planet. Below me, the sprawling city lights stretched out toward the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The massive steel gantry cranes of my maritime shipping hub stood proudly in the distance, illuminated by powerful halogen floodlights. I leaned against the cold wrought iron railing and took a long, deep breath. I listened to the muffled, agonizing sounds of my relatives tearing each other to pieces through the thick glass behind me. I searched my internal emotional landscape for any lingering sense of vindictive joy or triumphant celebration. I found absolutely nothing resembling happiness. There was no euphoric rush, no warm glow of victorious vindication. Instead, I experienced a profound, sweeping sensation of clean, sterile relief. It felt exactly like surviving a brutal surgical procedure. The diseased, infected tissue that had poisoned my system for my entire life was finally cleanly excised. The wound was raw and empty, but the lethal infection was permanently gone. A quiet footstep alerted me to another presence on the balcony. Elias Thorne stepped gracefully into the moonlight, his silver hair catching the ambient glow of the city. He did not speak immediately. He moved with the comfortable, unhurried grace of a man who had successfully navigated countless corporate wars. He held two tall, slender crystal glasses filled with chilled, sparkling water, a single twist of bright yellow lemon resting at the bottom of each flute. He extended his right hand, offering me one of the elegant beverages. I took the glass, feeling the soothing condensation against my palm. We stood together in comfortable, companionable silence for a long moment, simply watching the distant cargo ships slowly navigating the deep water shipping channels. He finally raised his glass a fraction of an inch, acknowledging the monumental victory we had just secured. I mirrored his gesture, and we drank the crisp, refreshing water. The simple, unpretentious celebration felt infinitely more valuable than the finest vintage champagne. As I swallowed the cold liquid, a profound, permanent realization settled deeply into my bones. The heavy, suffocating burden of playing the designated familial scapegoat was permanently lifted from my shoulders. For 30 years, I carried the crushing weight of their failures, absorbing their malicious insults and their projected insecurities. I was the dark mirror they utilized to make themselves feel artificially bright. That role was officially terminated. I was no longer a disappointing daughter or a tragic sibling. I was the undisputed sovereign of my own colossal empire, responsible only to myself and the vast logistical network I had built with my own calloused hands. I placed the empty crystal glass gently upon a nearby marble table. I nodded a final time to Elias, acknowledging our shared triumph. I turned my back on the distant muffled screaming, still echoing from the VIP lounge, fully prepared to walk away from my biological past forever. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the exterior stairwell, intending to bypass the venue entirely and return directly to my industrial headquarters. Before my fingers could grasp the cool metal, my secure cellular device emitted a sharp, urgent vibration against my ribs. I paused, my highly trained logistical instincts instantly flaring. I pulled the device from my jacket pocket and illuminated the screen. A priority encrypted message from Maya flashed across the display. The content was brief, chilling, and entirely unexpected. The hostile legacy investors I encountered near the stage had not retreated to lick their wounds. They had immediately utilized a highly obscure legal loophole within the Delaware Charter to file an emergency freeze order against my newly acquired assets. Furthermore, the filing revealed they were not acting alone. They were fully backed by an aggressively expanding, multi-billion-dollar European conglomerate intent on hostile regional domination. The vicious, bloody family war was finally over, but an infinitely larger, far more dangerous global corporate battle had just violently commenced. I slid the phone back into my pocket, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on my lips, ready to burn their archaic institutions to the ground. I descended the dimly lit exterior concrete stairwell, leaving the suffocating opulence of the grand ballroom far above me. The crisp, chilled Delaware night air washed over my face, carrying the faint, briny scent of the distant Atlantic Ocean and the heavy industrial aroma of burning diesel fuel from the commercial harbor. My mind rapidly processed the newly acquired intelligence regarding the hostile European conglomerate. They mistakenly believed my logistical syndicate was currently vulnerable following the brutal internal family purge. I mentally drafted a ruthless counteroffensive strategy, preparing to mobilize my formidable international legal team before dawn. The upcoming corporate warfare would require ultimate precision, but I welcomed the monumental challenge. The petty, exhausting domestic squabbles were officially finished, replaced by a glorious, high-stakes global battlefield where genuine titans clashed over billions of dollars in international trade. I pushed open the heavy ground floor exit door and stepped onto the brightly illuminated circular driveway, ready to permanently leave this pathetic chapter behind. The valet stand typically functioned as the primary artery for the departing elite, but tonight it served as a brutal public execution ground for fabricated wealth. The scene unfolding upon the polished concrete curb perfectly encapsulated the absolute destruction of my biological relatives. Patricia Harrison and Victoria stood huddled together, looking small and defeated. Their expensive formal garments offered zero protection against the biting coastal wind or their catastrophic new reality. A gigantic, heavily armored flatbed tow truck dominated the driveway. Its flashing yellow caution lights cast sickly amber shadows across their pale, terrified faces. Two stern state financial enforcement agents were currently securing thick steel chains around the axles of Derek's gleaming, custom-leased German luxury sedan. The government regulators were actively impounding the luxury vehicle as a highly visible depreciating asset tied directly to his extensive fraudulent commercial loans. Derek was nowhere to be seen, likely currently sitting in a sterile interrogation room downtown, facing severe federal prosecutors. But his catastrophic failures continued, punishing his enablers. This scenario perfectly aligned with the unforgiving logic of the American justice system, where heavily leveraged debt built upon criminal deception inevitably resulted in total physical asset forfeiture. Patricia shrieked hysterically at the indifferent government officials. She demanded they release the car, wholly unable to comprehend that her social authority was now non-existent. The financial investigators thoroughly ignored her theatrical demands, treating her like an annoying, invisible insect. Harrison stared blankly at the spinning amber lights, his previous arrogant bravado utterly erased by the terrifying prospect of imminent homelessness and the sudden termination of his unearned allowance. I remained silently near the towering marble columns of the main entrance, observing the chaotic spectacle with deep emotional detachment. A young valet attendant wearing a crisp crimson uniform vest suddenly noticed my presence. This was the exact same arrogant university student who had openly sneered at my attire earlier this evening. He possessed a background typical of privileged local youth, holding immense unearned educational debt while working a superficial luxury job, blindly worshiping the shallow markers of wealth. However, news of my supreme corporate takeover had clearly filtered down through the venue staff hierarchy like a violent shockwave. The attendant's previous haughty demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by profound, terrified reverence. His eyes widened significantly, and he practically stumbled over his own feet, rushing toward the wooden podium. He bypassed several wealthy patrons holding expensive claim tickets and frantically snatched my worn brass key from the locked security board. He did not utter a single condescending remark. He executed a deep, incredibly respectful bowing motion, recognizing the genuine apex predator standing before him. He sprinted aggressively across the expansive parking lot, desperate to retrieve my transport and appease the new owner of the regional economy. A deep, resonant, thunderous mechanical roar echoed across the sprawling asphalt, instantly silencing Patricia's pathetic shrieking. The valet carefully guided my dark-painted vintage truck toward the brightly lit loading zone. The imposing vehicle was a perfectly restored, late 20th century, high-performance transport marvel. I had spent 4 grueling years painstakingly rebuilding the chassis, frame by single frame, utilizing the exact same meticulous engineering principles I applied to my colossal deepwater shipping ports. Every single internal combustion component was customized, upgraded with modern forced induction systems and heavily reinforced suspension architecture. It was an industrial masterpiece, fundamentally worth more than the collective remaining net worth of my ruined family. The heavy metallic door closed with a solid, satisfying finality as the terrified attendant stepped away. He extended the brass key toward my open palm, with shaking fingers keeping his head bowed in a posture of complete submission. The rhythmic vibration of the powerful engine rattled the surrounding glass windows, projecting an aura of raw, undeniable power that absolutely dominated the upscale parking venue. I walked slowly toward the driver's side door, my sensible blazer cutting sharply through the cold wind. Victoria stared at the polished chrome bumper, her tear-streaked face reflecting in the immaculate dark paint. The profound realization that they had continuously mocked a priceless automotive masterpiece mirrored their catastrophic misjudgment of my intellectual capacity. Patricia broke away from the impound scene and lunged desperately toward the front of my truck. Her emerald gown dragged through a shallow puddle of dirty water, ruining the delicate silk fabric. She slammed her trembling, heavily jeweled hands against the solid steel hood. She cried out loudly, abandoning all pretense of maternal authority. She aggressively begged for a ride back to her sprawling, unpaid suburban estate, a massive property currently facing multiple impending foreclosure notices. She hysterically confessed that every single corporate credit card in her designer purse was simultaneously declined and permanently blocked by the central banking authorities moments ago. She had spent her entire privileged life effortlessly gliding upon the financial stability provided by others, never once considering the fundamental mechanics of genuine survival or the consequences of betrayal. Now, she pleaded for a tiny fraction of mercy, terrified of facing the harsh, unforgiving elements without her stolen financial armor or her hired driving staff. She promised to change her behavior, uttering desperate, empty apologies that held absolutely no currency in my newly established kingdom. I gripped the solid metal handle and pulled the heavy door open, climbing effortlessly into the luxurious custom leather interior. I settled into the comfortable seat, feeling the comforting rumble of the engine vibrating through the steering column. I rolled the reinforced glass window down just a few inches, allowing the chilled night air to circulate through the pristine cabin. I looked down at my mother from my elevated position, observing the ruined shell of the woman who had mercilessly tormented me for 3 decades. She stood shivering on the cold concrete, surrounded by the terrifying consequences of her own malicious actions. My voice contained zero anger, zero malice, and zero hesitation. I delivered my final statement with chilling calm, knowing it would haunt her remaining impoverished days. I told them they could walk. I pressed a smooth electronic button, sealing the cabin completely, as the thick glass powered upward, physically and permanently separating my reality from their impending doom. I engaged the heavy transmission and pressed my foot firmly onto the accelerator pedal. The engine roared triumphantly, leaving the ruined group stranded upon the freezing concrete curb. I watched their small, insignificant figures rapidly shrink and disappear entirely within my rearview mirror. As I navigated toward the dark coastal highway, my encrypted dashboard communication console flashed brightly. The digital screen signaled an incoming secure transmission from my International Defense Council. The pathetic domestic past was dead, and the brutal European corporate war had officially commenced, ensuring the relentless expansion of my maritime empire would face an entirely new, magnificent challenge before the sun dared to rise again. The image of a mother, a brother, and a sister standing shivering on a cold Delaware curb as a rusted yet perfect vintage truck fades into the night is more than just a cinematic conclusion to a corporate war. It is a profound, chilling mirror held up to the very foundation of the American family. When we strip away the multi-million-dollar logistics empires, the forged commercial deeds, and the sparkling sapphire pendants, what remains is a raw, unflinching examination of parenting responsibility and the true cost of transactional love. We often believe that providing for our children means securing their physical comfort and social standing. In the sprawling, ambitious landscape of modern American culture, the definition of a good family frequently becomes warped. It morphs into a relentless pursuit of outward perfection, where children are no longer nurtured individuals, but performing assets in a generational portfolio. Patricia, the matriarch of our story, embodies this tragic distortion. She treated her family dynamic like a high-risk hedge fund, shorting her youngest daughter while heavily investing in the superficial charm of the others. But what happens when the market crashes? When the fabricated wealth evaporates, so too does the illusion of conditional love. In traditional American culture, the family was historically viewed as an unbreakable unit, rooted in shared sacrifice and collective responsibility. Parents were tasked with not just feeding their young, but forging their moral compasses. The tragic deterioration of Bridget's family illustrates exactly what occurs when that traditional foundation is entirely replaced by the ruthless metrics of corporate climbing and shallow social status. The architecture of honest parenting. At the heart of raising capable, emotionally healthy children within a traditional family structure lies the absolute necessity of honesty and fairness. These are not merely moral buzzwords. They are the structural steel that prevents a family from collapsing under immense external pressure. Bridget's ultimate triumph was not born from malice, but from an intimate understanding of genuine value, a lesson she had to teach herself in the dark, isolated corners of her upbringing. She learned to build maritime deepwater ports and restore classic truck engines with calloused hands. She understood that a strong foundation requires tangible, honest effort. Conversely, her siblings were taught to build their lives on leveraged lies and forged signatures. When parents model deceit as a viable survival strategy, they do not just risk legal ruin. They fundamentally cripple their children's ability to navigate the real world. Harrison's violent entitlement and Victoria's paralyzed terror in the face of sudden adversity are the direct, inevitable results of a mother who valued aesthetics over accountability. If we do not teach our children the weight of honest labor and the undeniable consequences of their actions, the world will eventually teach them those identical lessons with ruthless, unforgiving brutality. Emotional awareness and the transactional family. Perhaps the most terrifying moment in Bridget's journey was not the confrontation with the hostile board of directors, but the sickening instant the Delaware state regulators escorted Derek out of the VIP lounge. The very second the financial lifeline was severed, the family did not band together in solidarity. Instead, they turned on each other with the feral, unthinking viciousness of starving animals. Patricia and Harrison immediately weaponized their panic against Victoria, proving that their familial loyalty was entirely transactional. This catastrophic implosion highlights the vital importance of emotional awareness in parenting. A healthy family is a safe harbor, a place where unconditional support exists, independent of financial or social success. When parents fail to cultivate emotional intelligence, when they use guilt, gaslighting, and blatant favoritism to control their household, they create a fragile ecosystem destined for permanent destruction. Children raised in this environment do not learn how to naturally love. They learn how to survive each other. They become masters of psychological manipulation, constantly scanning the room for the next threat, even if that threat is sitting directly across the Thanksgiving dinner table. Bridget survived by stepping completely out of this toxic arena, recognizing that the heavy burden of being the family scapegoat was an artificial weight placed upon her by deeply damaged people. The inheritance of character. As we guide our children through the complexities of modern life, we must deliberately ask ourselves what kind of legacy we are truly leaving behind. The most valuable inheritance is never a corporate trust fund, a leased luxury sedan, or an expansive suburban estate. It is the quiet, unbreakable resilience of a well-formed character. It is the profound ability to look at a shattered situation, assess the surrounding damage with a clear mind, and calmly begin to rebuild. Bridget's departure in the flawlessly restored vintage pickup truck is a masterclass in this specific concept. The vehicle, much like Bridget herself, was mocked and underestimated by those who only understood superficial value. Yet underneath the surface, it possessed a high-performance, meticulously crafted engine capable of outlasting any modern luxury car. We must actively strive to build our children like that truck, making them resilient, authentic, and completely capable of weathering the darkest, coldest nights without breaking down. We owe it to them to provide long-term guidance that prioritizes moral fortitude over temporary convenience. Parenting is an endurance sport, requiring decades of consistent, patient instruction. It demands that we occasionally let our children struggle so they can learn the vital mechanics of self-reliance. We must be the parents who teach our children to value the dirt on their hands from an honest day's work infinitely more than the stolen jewels resting around their necks, ensuring they know exactly who they are when the world attempts to tell them otherwise. A legacy of truth. Stories like Bridget's resonate so deeply because they tap into our most primal fears and our highest aspirations. They force us to examine the velvet curtains of our own lives and violently question the structural integrity of our closest personal relationships. The brutal betrayal she faced is a stark reminder that biological blood does not automatically equal genuine loyalty. If you find yourself captivated by these intricate tales of betrayal, justice, and the ultimate triumph of the resilient underdog, I highly encourage you to follow the channel Linda Vengeance. It is a space dedicated exclusively to unraveling the complex, often hidden dynamics of family drama, delivering deeply satisfying conclusions where hard truth consistently outshines fabricated deception. Join the community to explore more stories that challenge our perspectives and keep us deeply engaged with the raw realities of human nature. As the taillights of that vintage truck disappear into the freezing Delaware night, leaving the shattered remnants of a fraudulent family stranded on the concrete curb, a lingering silence settles over the entire scene. The global corporate war waiting on the horizon seems almost simple compared to the brutal, intimate warfare of blood and kin. The cold reality of their situation is the final, inescapable lesson, demonstrating that you absolutely cannot cheat your way out of the severe consequences you have built for yourself. It leaves us staring directly into the empty space they left behind, wondering intensely about the foundations we are currently laying in our own homes. Are the walls we build around our loved ones made of heavy, honest stone? Or are they hollow facades, merely waiting for a strong wind to completely tear them down? When the bright lights inevitably fade and the external worldly pressures rapidly mount, who will stand firmly beside us in the dark? And who will we eventually find ourselves leaving behind in the rearview mirror? The answers to those questions are rarely simple, and quite often they are quietly waiting in the deep reflections we are simply too afraid to meet.